This week on LCARA HAMRadio, we're going to do our mega POTA at a registered park in the Lake Cumberland area. And we're going to invite our friends from the Civil Air Patrol. That's what's coming up next this week on LCARA HAMRadio. Well, we made it out on one crisp and cool morning, and eventually into the afternoon to the Mill Springs battlefield. Lake Cumberland Amateur Radio Association decided that we needed another event on our schedule, and that event was coined the Mega POTA. Now, what makes this a Mega POTA? Well, first off, we're going to be doing this as a club, and we're going to have multiple stations here at the battlefield making contacts and activating the park on multiple bands. We had a goal of doing digital and voice. We also had a very welcome addition to this event, the local Civil Air Patrol. And as we'll see in some additional video coming up, they were a lot of fun to have with us and an ultimately potential source for new hams. Let's talk a little bit about Mill Springs Battlefield. Now, a lot of times you'll go to a park to do an activation, and the park is pretty standard. You can show up in your vehicle, make a few contacts, and move on. In fact, there are folks who make this a very interesting hobby. Let's see how many parks you can activate in a day. For us, we're going to go to the Mill Springs Registered National Monument here and activate the park. And here on the POTA website, you can see this will ultimately be Park K 7708. There's a national cemetery next to the museum as well, and many of our fallen veterans or veterans that eventually passed away are buried today. But next door to the cemetery is the museum for the Mill Springs Battlefield. And the Mill Springs Battlefield has some special significance in the Civil War, which we'll see in just a moment. When doing a Parks on the Air, one of the things that you want to do is make sure that you get permission if you need to. We did so. We wanted to make sure we weren't going to be in anybody's way. And so we checked in with the museum, and the museum itself is not where the battlefield was. We need to go down the road just a little bit and actually reach the battlefield itself. But the museum is about a mile away from the actual battlefield, and when you look at the pin on the map for the Parks on the Air, it's actually showing the museum and not the battlefield itself. So let's head on over to the actual battlefield. And in fact, we ended up utilizing what was known as Site 3. And there's a gravel parking lot where there would be plenty of room for us to spread out, both as Amateur Radio and Civil Air Patrol. Mill Springs Battlefield was one of the first major victories by the Union Army in the actual Civil War. And here we're looking at some of the signage at the park talking about the last stand. Now, Kentucky joined the Civil War, if you want to call it that, as a neutral state. It wasn't picking sides, but ultimately you had folks fighting for both sides from the state of Kentucky. Many of the Confederates, though, on this day had come up from Tennessee. And as we continue to pan here on the signage, we'll see a picture of a wood carving, which was a depiction of the battle that day. KY4CKP and I, when we were young boys, visited this same battlefield before it was even a registered landmark to watch a battle reenactment. We didn't remember much about that day. We thought it was kind of interesting. There seemed to be a lot of loud bangs as the Confederate reenactors and the Union reenactors fired seemingly weapons at each other. But ultimately, it was a lot of fun just to visit. And today, as adults, we go back to that time when our country was divided. Here's some additional signage. Rutledge's Battery. This was a Confederate artillery unit which fired from a position higher up to try to dislodge the Union encampment. You can see the cannon there in the center of this particular photo. Many of the officers that were fighting on both sides of the war were actual West Point graduates. Ultimately, the Confederates didn't win out at this particular engagement, providing the Union Army with a much-needed victory. Now, moving on to the POTA. Here we can see that it was a cloudy day. Pretty cool this day. It wasn't overly cold where you wouldn't want to be out there, but still a jacket was in need. And here we're looking at an antenna that one of our members had set up. I believe this was a Chameleon M-Pass antenna. And ultimately, the person sat in their car and made some contacts. There's our member with the blue hat. But you can also see some of the Civil Air Patrol cadets. We invited the Civil Air Patrol to come and visit us. In fact, in years past, AC4DM and WM4LM, when they lived in Tennessee, headed up the Civil Air Patrol when they were, many years ago when they were younger, and utilized amateur radio in many of their Civil Air Patrol exercises and practice engagements. Here we're looking at 4 Low Hams, Toyota Tundra, KY4CKP's vehicle there. And as we pan from left to right, we can see the MCOM trailer is set up. We try to get the MCOM trailer out as much as possible. It's a wonderful card to have out there, the signage and so forth, to let the community know amateur radio is alive and well. We're also looking at the smoker grill that I brought up from Tennessee. Ultimately, I got the right pellets in it. I had too moist of some pellets in there originally, but I bought some other pellets, and we definitely grilled some burgers and hot dogs. We did get a little bit of rain later that afternoon, but overall, not too bad. Definitely not too hot. Hot dogs and burgers ultimately, plus some chips, buns, and some desserts. Everybody was fed today, or that day, Civil Air Patrol and Lake Cumberland Amateur Radio Association members alike. And as we pan one more time from the cannons over to the left, it just really warms our hearts to be able to bring in another organization to this mega POTA event. This is an event we plan to do each year now, and we hope to make it larger and larger every year that it goes by. It's got to start somewhere, and this was the first time. 2-meter antenna there as we continue to communicate with folks on the repeater. Folks, this video and the picture to come up after it is what it's all about. Many times we hear comments about amateur radio where, well, it's an old person's hobby. There aren't enough young people in this hobby. And why is that? Well, the reason we don't have enough young people in this hobby is we're not reaching out to them as much as we could be. You'll notice that most of these cadets are high schoolers. They are in ROTC and Civil Air Patrol in this case. And they could be very much interested in amateur radio if somebody would just get out there and show them what can be done and how much fun you can have. It's this younger generation that will ultimately keep amateur radio on the air. In fact, we've got several commitments from the group as a whole. Not only their leaders want to get their amateur radio license, but they're going to act as mentors for these young people to get involved. And then one last picture coming up here, folks. Look for these other organizations in your community. There are many other organizations that may not even be aware that an amateur radio club is in the area and that they could utilize your services. Here we have AC4DM, one of our senior Elmers, president of our club, showing these young folks how to get on the air, how to do it with the right terminology and with third-party traffic, getting them involved, showing them how much fun this hobby can be. For the Lake Cumberland Amateur Radio Association, we hope that you will take a video like this and let it inspire you and reach out to those other organizations in your area and your community. I'm KY4 BDP Brian. We hope you liked the video 73, and we hope to see you down the road.